What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS. You're my girl, Dr. Layla Brown, and you're tuned into season 2, episode 19 of The Last Dope Intellectual. All right, y'all. So before we get into our shoot the shit today, we have one new patron, Joseph Cornell. So thank you for helping us keep the lights on and pay our producer. So, Two Black, you wanted us to shoot the shit about a particular topic. So take it away.
Yesterday, but it won't be yesterday when y'all watch this. CBS and Layla did a conversation on Kwame Nkrumah's book, and I'm going to name both titles, whether conscientism or conscientism, whichever one you want to call it. I look forward, because I got to edit that, I look forward to actually rewatching it, because, I never really get to focus as much when I'm watching for technical stuff. But it was a good discussion on the book, and I think that book, out of all his work, whether you're talking about class struggle, neocolonialism, all of his work, I think that book is seen as this book that's like too hard to reach, and I think y'all made it very understandable, even if you've not read the book. Because for people who don't know, this book has literal equations inside of it, and I think y'all did a good job of breaking that down and making it make sense, and also making it just not feel as intimidating. And Erica was there too. So I just want to just kind of do a reflection on how that went, and maybe give people a little sense of how y'all approach that discussion. You don't have to go too deep in any particular concept, but just how y'all approach it.
So the first thing I want to say is just a small pat on the back, which Sharice and I both talked about. So I guess as academics, as intellectuals, as activists, like a lot of times we read things in a very kind of utilitarian way, and we will zone into a particular section. And one of the things Sharice and I both said was how good we felt about ourselves for having reread cover to cover in preparation for the seminar. So I would say that I just think oh, and we also talked about, even in the process of rereading, what kinds of new questions kind of came up for us, and what as a result of the work that we've been doing in the time since the last time we might have encountered the text, helped us to ask new questions, to think differently about some of the struggles that we're engaging in. So one of the things I will just say as a general personal reflection is how much I appreciate the opportunity to reread the text and think about what it means to present the text, and also the kind of behind the scenes work study that Sharice and I did together in order to even figure out how we would prepare to present the text.
I mean, I'll just say it's interesting. I feel like LDI and the previous seminar that we did, the Insight seminar, really are good preparation for it, because we're so used to just exchanging ideas and of kind of just doing things a little bit, I wouldn't say last minute, but doing things more toward the finish line than the start line. That is just it things just really kind of come together. And I think it was the same for this this workshop. What I'll say I appreciate is I just like the different perspectives that Layla and I bring to things, right? Because we disagreed about, or we had different perspectives about Eurocentrism vis-a-vis the text, for example, about the different responsibility. I'll just put it like the different responsibilities of Nkrumah to Marxism, right? To a Marxism versus to understanding his historical and material conditions in real time, and many other things. And so I just appreciate how we bring different perspectives to that, and being able to talk through it for a broader audience, because people tend to fall on one or another side, or perhaps they've not even thought about it one way or the other. So I think that I enjoyed that aspect of this particular workshop, and just our sort of collaboration in general.
Well, as y'all know, I follow y'all wherever you go. So once I seen that that y'all were hosting that, or that y'all were putting that together, I registered immediately, because that is a book that I read with my book club, Liberation Through Reading. And those first two chapters, if you're not familiar with philosophy, are really tough because it's a lot of jargon. It's a lot of like historical context that he's building on. And I did appreciate that, something that I didn't think of in that way, because I think I took away from it, similar to you, Layla, with not so much it being Eurocentric, but using those texts because that was what he was, that was what he was familiar with, but then also to lay a certain groundwork for how we have come to understand ourselves through these people, and why they, where those perspectives came from, and why that's projected onto popular study in academia, and what the results of those were. But I do agree that, in hindsight, like, as when it was said, when Cherise said it, then I was like, yeah, that is a lot of white people. Like, but it wasn't something that I was like initially thinking of when I was thinking through it. But it is a book that I do tell folks to read constantly, because I do think that you all raise really good critical questions about what it means to unpack a lot of what's being what's being learned through these academic practices. And I think that that's what he was trying to do in cultivating this theory. And I did learn that there was two different ways to pronounce this. I never knew there was two different ways, and I do struggle with like conscientism, and then I'm like, well, conscientism seems a lot easier to say, so that might be my go-to now. Yeah, and it was one other point that I wanted to make, but I can't remember, so it'll probably come to me. But yeah, I think overall it was great.
Yeah, you listen, when we got in, and I was like, Erica, the first one in the chat. I will say we always appreciate how much you engage, and also like you don't just be there, like you're there, like you really do engage. But this is something that I didn't say during the seminar, and it's something I've been thinking about, and I wonder if, obviously, conscientism makes sense because he's talking about consciousness, right? But then I don't know, there's something maybe to thinking about the science of philosophy, that maybe there's something there too, why conscientism might make sense in that regard. But I will say that, like, I am not particularly, well, no, I'm not well versed in European philosophers at all. It was interesting rereading the text for this purpose, because I think when you first encounter a text like conscientism, you're inclined to want to figure out all of the people that Nkrumah is referencing, to try to figure out, okay, what are the arguments that they're making and how do they come together? But then I think one of the things that Cherise pointed out is that in some ways none of it matters, right? And so even as he's sort of going through the litany of people, if you're able to, for me, when I was able to not get so caught up in the correctness of the interpretation or the specificities of what each thinker brought to the table, and try to focus more on the arguments that Nkrumah was trying to make, it did make it easier to read the text, because I think that's the hindrance I think that a lot of people encounter when they read the text. It's just like he's bringing so many people into the conversation, and I feel like I can't even start this book because I'm not familiar with all these other people that he's referencing, and that is a tension and a struggle, and I think it's an important question to ask oneself. But again, I think you have to temper that to the degree that it matters for the purpose of the text, if that makes sense.
And I do have a philosophy background. And so I would say that actually can be a bit of a hindrance, because on my reading, he actually misread Descartes and he actually misread Amo. And then if you're reading it in a particular way, that can sort of stop you in your tracks and make you invalidate everything that comes after because of those misreadings. And there's actually like a contradiction where on the one hand he places Descartes as an idealist, but on the other hand he says Descartes is the basis of socialism. But for him, socialism comes out of materialist philosophy. So which is it, right? Is he an idealist and a pseudo solipsist, or is he the basis of material egalitarianism? So anyway, so sometimes knowing that, I think that's what allows a lot of people to discount what he's saying, right? And so there's a way in which if you just take it as these white folks were saying this shit and it doesn't really matter, you don't need to know more about it than what he's laying out. He's offered what you need to know. There is a way that can be it can be helpful, right? And not have you get like bogged down in whatever details.
I will also say that, like, just in a general sense, I think the last count that we were told in terms of the numbers of registrants for the workshop, that it was over like 250 people. And I would just say again, that's as much as people, to everybody's point, talk about it as a difficult text, that level of interest, I think, is reassuring at this moment, that people are wanting to engage it in whatever kind of way, whether it's to work with it, to refute it, to think through it, to build from it, whatever it is. I think that is just a general positive takeaway for me from the seminar.
I did appreciate, though, that you raising the Walter Rodney piece, because I did not know that existed. But then I also thought it was interesting, especially considering we speak with Monique, that he later addresses a lot of that in his criticisms of Ujima. So when Walter Rodney wrote that piece, that was in what, 1970?
72.
Yeah, and then the criticism for African socialism that Nkrumah wrote was, like, I think in 1967. So at some point, I guess he came to an understanding, but I do appreciate that Walter Rodney was able to detail that he was still struggling through ideas, and he was thinking through ideas in real time. And a lot of the work that he produced is a product of him thinking through those ideas. And I think that we take that sort of thing for granted. Like, I think that even when talking about that book in particular, that people cemented as like, this is his collective works, this is what, this is his theory, without even seeing that he was working through a theory and not really cementing it as the final theory. And I think that's even the case, I think, for intercommunalism. Like, I think that people don't really view these things as people working through a process, but just attaching it as like, this is the theory.
Well, it reminded me when Monique, as you all will hear later, when Monique talked about Nyerere starting as an idealist. That's precisely the trajectory that Rodney mapped out for Nkrumah, that basically conscientism was his foray into Marxism-Leninism. That's when he was really taking it up seriously. Prior to that, he had been he had a more idealist approach. And what that reminded me of is like Martin Luther King, W.B. Du Bois, that a lot of these people start with the sort of idealist conception because of I think it's because of the huge impact of colonization on the mind and the sort of ethical and moral foundations of colonization that are so brutal and so violent, that the idea that a change in ethics and a change in the way one sees oneself, or a cultural change, actually, that's compelling, right? But then when one sees like, okay, shit's still fucked up, that moves one to a more materialist analysis, right? Or a more sort of foundational, like anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist analysis.
I think the text was brought to a level that made sense, and I think, like it's already just been stated right before me, like you're catching him at a certain time. So if we're being materialist in how we approach the critique, then we can critique it not in the sense of, oh, this is just wrong or right, but like understanding where this person was, what their thoughts were, what was being fleshed out, and then just take that as is. And then there's other work that bounces off of. I don't think any scholar writes this kind of like, it's nice to think about it like that, like somebody writes a magnum opus, or this just amazing piece that just lives on and there's nothing else that needs to be said on the topic. But that's just not how anything works, like in anyone. I mean, even when we're talking about someone like Marx or whatever, like there's plenty of critiques to be made. It doesn't mean it's useless though. And I just think I think y'all did a good job, especially when you were going back and forth. And I would encourage people to watch it once it's up, just seeing a discussion on a book versus just like trying to read it in isolation. I think it also highlights why, like, when we talk about like being in an organization with people, and as much as people beat up on book clubs and study groups and stuff like that, like this is why you do it with people, because you all bring, different, you bring an experience to the table as well as just other points of reference. Like CBS was saying, she has a philosophy background, Layla didn't approach it that way. But you're able to have a great discussion because you can bring all those things to the table versus you try to read that alone, talking about the book, and you're looking in and you see like, caret symbols and all of that stuff, and you're trying to understand what's going on. Like it's like a lot. The first time I had heard about the book, I think somebody had just posted a screenshot of that. So I was in no interest to get to that book anytime soon, when I saw that. So it's like, but when we come together in as groups, like it's easier that way. I think even on the Black Myths podcast, like when we all read text and then we have to come down, and it's very similar. We have to take a text and break it down usually to debunk a myth. Like it's much different. I think y'all can speak to that too. When you have to like talk to people this way versus I'm just reading this because I need to know it, or it's a reference in something I'm writing or whatever, and I don't have to actually explain it to anybody. It's like totally different worlds of reading. Like it's not even like you're studying on one side, the other side you're studying in a different way, totally different.
Yeah, and I just want to, in Nkrumah's defense, that theorems chapter is the last chapter. It's not like he was like, all right, let's start with this math. Like he laid it all out. And basically what he was doing is giving the matter that was grounding the appearance of the analysis. That's all that those theorems are meant to do. But the other thing, so this is my annoyance about the sort of the people calling all this shit academic. What people mean is precisely what you said, I think, to Black, about breaking things down, right? And so what people say academic, they mean jargon. They mean having a particular level of discourse. But number one, that shit is not reducible to academia because it happens in organizations, it happens in other industries like law, but also in academia, we have to break shit down. What the fuck do you think teaching is? We can't go in there. Well, some people do, and that's why they need to stick to research.
It's just bad teaching, and then
right?
Yeah.
So I get annoyed about calling things academic as a like when what people mean is like using a level of jargon or having talking at a particular level, which no, right? In a workshop or whatever, you need to make it accessible. You need to make it conversational. You need to make it so that people have an entry point, right? And so yeah, it just gets on my goddamn nerves when people call shit academic. And I guess because I am one, but I'm just kind of like, be precise. Like, what exactly are you saying? That term just becomes a catch-all for all the shit people don't like or all the thing that makes them feel uncomfortable. And it's like, the fuck is you talking about? Because I'm an academic. So when people say like, don't do an academic thing, it's like, I'm an academic. What do you mean? And I literally am one, a good one, and I can talk in any number of ways. So like, what is you saying?
Everything is not a 101 level either. Like, I just think people need to be honest about that. Like, everything cannot be reduced to a 101 or a 100 level kind of thing. Talk to me like I'm a second grader. Like, some things just aren't going to be like that. I mean, I think that is idealism in and of itself, thinking that everything, no matter how complex the topic, can be reduced down to, well, this is an abusive relationship between Ukraine and Russia or something. You can't. For people that don't know, that's a running thing on the internet. It's a terrible analysis, but like everything just can't be reduced down to this kind of like pop cultural thing. Like it's just not plausible. Yes, you do need to make things understandable, but you also even when people call Du Bois an idealist, I think I've read people have said about him is he's also trying to challenge people to come up a level too. Like you don't just simply always just throw people the most bottom feeder shit you can find and like, okay, that's a good enough understanding. Like sometimes there's nothing wrong with challenging people sometimes. Be like, okay, I don't understand this and I do need to have other points of reference to enter into this conversation. Because when you try to dumb everything down, you just lose the actual issue you're trying to work towards. You just lose that by trying to make it relatable or understandable in ways that it goes the opposite direction. It actually makes it something that doesn't make sense anymore, because now we're talking about, again, to use that example, an abusive relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and you think it can be reduced down to some kind of like, self-help book on toxicity or something. And that's just not how you understand geopolitics. Like, we've talked on here before about the limitations of metaphors and stuff like that. But I think that's still part of like trying to make things ultra relatable. And it's like, if y'all watched this session, y'all talked about a book And of course, people who have no understanding are going to miss some things, but it can still give them some intrigue to want to look up more, because you don't need to understand everything either the first time you hear it or the first time you read it. Like, that's not realistic either.
I think part of the problem with the use of academic in the way that we're talking about is that people expect people to be able to do all things, right? And there is a difference between people who are teaching and people who are taking the information to write a particular thing, to move an idea a certain kind of way. And I think that teaching is not always about breaking everything down to one-on-one level, but it's that it is, even though I know you said you're uncomfortable with the word, but it is about relatability. When I say that, I mean, what about it makes sense for your own context, and what do you need to know about it for whatever it is that you're trying to do, right? And I think that is part of what happens when a person goes into those types of situations as a teacher, and everybody's role is not to teach, and everybody's role is not to always do those things, right? And so I think that's part of the issue that's happening with all that.
Yeah, I will say that I'm often like, I get hit with that because I believe in vigorous study, but I am a college dropout, but I still get hit with that because of it, because I also don't believe that everything should be broken down to explain to a 5-year-old, because there's things that I explain to my son that, that he comprehends a little bit more than some others. So I don't really necessarily believe that. I think that we should push to challenge how people are able to comprehend things. I think we should push to expand people's comprehension in the way they do that. And I think that having discussions with multiple people, having group discussions, helps formulate that, because you know who you can talk to a certain way and who you can't. Like the way that I talk about Russia and Ukraine, my mother cannot be the way that I talk to you guys about Russia and Ukraine, because she's of that propagandized MSNBC all the time. So the conversations that I would have with people who are not in that would be completely different, with having to like walk back from the basics and start from the like very, very beginning and walk forward, So I think that that's the thing that's missing. But I also think that what I find value in not only this LDI, but what you all did yesterday, is that it really does show the usefulness of like collective thinking and collective struggle and working out ideas collectively. Like I think that the two of you do that so well. I mean, even you two Black, like, because I enjoy shooting the shit to watch that y'all struggle with ideas. It's not necessarily about like agreeing, disagreeing, but sort of points of unity that moves y'all forward in not only the discussion but the work. And I think that was something that I pulled away from the conversation that y'all had, because there was things that I thought through. It's like, well, you know what, I should revisit the book. And then there was a certain point that I even went and grabbed the book, like let me read it along with y'all and make sure, because I wanted to be able to maybe see it from a different perspective, see it from newer, fresher eyes. Even the points that you made, Sharice, again, like that was something that I did not take away, but I still was able to still understand what Layla was saying, because that was my initial, thought. So I always appreciate the way that y'all make that seamless, that struggle does not always have to be contentious. It does not always have to be like, I know what I'm talking about, you don't know shit. Like, it's just like all ideas out on the table, and let's see what we can work with and what we can't, and pick up what we can use and leave what we can't. And I think that was something that is so valuable, what this program provides, but it's something that I always try to instill and walk away with when I'm doing like little teaching things.
I guess the last thing I'll say is like, don't automatically assume that somebody's trying to show that they're smarter than you or trying to dunk on you if they start with a particular vocabulary or at a different, and people, they might start high and not realize, because I think it's paternalistic to assume that everybody doesn't know shit. You know what I'm saying? Like that that is equally bad, to assume that people can't meet you where they're at, even if they've never read a text or whatever. But like this idea that somebody's performing mastery or somebody is trying to dunk on you because of the language that they use or whatever, it's not that. It's just like we all enter at different, in different ways. And I think that what's important is how can we, like you were saying, how can we come together through the conversation to meet each other where we're at and then come to a point of understanding. So
so for this week's planting thoughts, we have the Euphorbia trigona, or otherwise known as the African milk tree. So even though this plant looks like a cactus, it kind of walks and talks like a cactus too. It's actually not a cactus, it's a succulent. They're native to Central Africa. They can actually get pretty tall. They're used in a lot of places as hedges or shrubs. Even though it's not a cactus, it does better in a sandy mixed soil, and it's actually resistant to pests. So, I mean, sorry, not pets, pest. And so it actually makes a pretty good house pet. And like I said, it grows pretty fast, so it can give you some joy there. But you know, the African milk tree is just one of those reminders that things aren't always as they seem. And that is this week's plant for planting thoughts, the African milk tree. Okay, you all. So we have an exciting interview today, but first we want to introduce our co-host, Erica Keynes, also known as Ricky Ryan, always in the chat, big supporter of the show. Our people, we are so happy to have you here. And she is going to help us with our interview today. So today we have Dr. Monique Bodacy, who is an associate professor of history and African American studies at Washington University in St. Louis, where she teaches courses in African history, Caribbean history, and Africana studies. Broadly, her research interests include the intellectual, political, and social history of decolonization, pan-Africanism, African diasporic politics, and transnational approaches to history. She is the author of the award-winning book, which we will be discussing today, Jah Kingdom, Rastafarians, Tanzania, and Pan-Africanism in the Age of Decolonization. So please help us welcome Dr. Monique Bodacy.
Welcome, Monique.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Okay, so we have a lot of ground to cover, so let's just hop right in. So, Dr. Bodacy, can you start by talking about the intersections of Pan-Africanism and Rastafarianism, and perhaps even defining or sort of describing these for our audience, and why Tanzania is an important site for their convergence in what you call the age of decolonization?
Okay, so Rasta people generally believe that all people of African descent are connected, right? You know, that Peter Tosh song, If You're a Black Man, You're an African, captures it perfectly. And that shared experiences of oppression connect us, but also the quest for liberation should also connect us, right? So on a very basic level, there's quite a bit of diversity within Rastafari, but all Rasta people are committed to that, or those ideas of Pan-Africanism for sure, right? Now, Tanzania becomes this site of not only diaspora aspiration more broadly in this period, the 60s and the 70s, but becomes a site for this particular case of repatriation, because this moment, the age of decolonization, as I call it, brings about the rise of Black-led nation states on the African continent. And there is, I would argue, a shift from a more diaspora-inspired Pan-Africanism to the continent, right? That these are the leaders. Garvey wants to repatriate or to bring about this wholesale repatriation. I would argue that is very difficult, didn't happen within the context of colonialism. Then we have these new nation states, and we have these leaders who are committed to a path of Pan-Africanism, even as they're defining national sovereignty. So leaders like Rodney and Nkrumah, who welcome diasporic Africans to return, to use that word, to the continent, inspire this kind of movement, this kind of mobilization. And so it's, I would argue, a different phase of Pan-African practice, brought about by a couple of different elements that emerge in this particular period, in the 1960s and 70s, right? Now, when Rastafari emerged in the 1930s, Ethiopia was the homeland, right? The site of this desire to return, for obvious reasons, the home of Haile Selassie, the god of Rasta people. But by the time we get to the 1960s and 70s, not only has Pan-Africanism changed, right? But it's also the very real historical events. Like by the time we get to the 70s, Haile Selassie is deposed. A lot is going on in Ethiopia. Then he dies, and one of the Rasta men I talk about in the book, said in a very pragmatic way, I really just wanted a peaceful place to return to. And Tanzania by then had become a celebrated, among Black Power advocates and others, a celebrated space of Pan-African activity, a mecca of Pan-African activity. And so it came together as a result of many different, I'm leaving some out, but in the interest of brevity, a lot of different elements came together to make the Pan-Africanism of Rasta people and Tanzania's Pan-Africanism come together.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I really did enjoy Jack Kingdom for those very reasons. But in the book, it touches a lot on the contradictions of multiracialism in Jamaica, and it also addresses the difficulties of creating an African state inclusive of the African diaspora. So would you say that both multiracialism and an all-African state obscures the questions of not just class, but, the indigenous peoples?
Yes, I think the best way to get at that question is to go back a bit and look at the context, right? So I would go to the earlier period of colonial rule, let's say the 30s even, right? Where within the context of British colonial rule in particular, this concept of racialism, you go through racialism to get back to multiracialism, but this idea that British colonial officials used to police any kind of pro-Black anti-colonial activity, certainly used against Rastafari from as early as the 1930s. And they would accuse Rasta people and others of racialism, which for them meant they were inciting and creating racial problems in places where racial problems did not exist, which is really crazy, right? So they denied, despite all the evidence we have of the extent to which or how they actually went about creating a racial hierarchy. They accused, any kind of pro-Black anti-colonial activist of creating this racialism, right? So that has a long history, right? Now, by the time we get to around the 50s, just a decade before independence starts to take off in 1960 into the 60s, it shows up in response to not just the kind of anti-colonial activity of movements like Rastafari, but in African political parties, right, that are trying to advocate for majority representation, right? So African representation, how they're going to start to negotiate replacing colonial governments with African ones, right? And so it comes up also in conversations over the Central African Federation. So multiracialism becomes a way, or it's a framework to help colonial officials to not only keep the peace in their minds, to maintain the racial hierarchy that they created, but also to preserve the power of non-African people in these colonial spaces, right? Now, what's interesting about that is when we get to the post-independence period, I talk about the Jamaican government adopting this multiracialism. And in that context, it becomes the sort of myth of national unity, right? Every nation has a myth to keep people together. And of course, to directly respond to your question, it denies the real struggles of people of African descent, it denies class difference, and it really glosses over, people like to say we don't have race in the Caribbean, we only have class. But of course it glosses over all of that history, and it, works hard, state officials work hard to also suppress that kind of activism within its borders, right? On the other side, on the continent, right, Nyerere, to answer the question in terms of Jack Kingdom, Nyerere decides that he's not going to use race as an organizing principle. So he does a kind of non-racialism move, right? And his rationale is that he's not going to allow colonial ideas to dictate how he decides who will belong to the Tanzanian nation. And a lot of Black people in this period and before we're trying to balance. We know that race is socially constructed, but it is a reality. How do we actually not become barbarians, but also deal with the fact of racism, right? As opposed to racialism. So onto the indigenous thing, there are some contradictions with Nyerere, of course, I talk about in the book, because he says this, but then he's very clear in English and in Swahili in the documents to the Rasta people he allows to enter Tanzania, that they have to be Black to actually gain residency and citizenship in Tanzania, right? So there are all sorts of things going on behind the scenes. But I will say what's interesting about how that worked in a continental African context is that in Africa, in large measure, it is about who is indigenous, right? And in the colonial period, the British took care of that by designating, categories of native and non-native. And they were very happy to be non-native because it secured certain privileges in the colonial period, right? When we're getting to the end of colonial rule, it gets a little more nebulous, right? Because they want to stay, they want to secure, the type of power and privileges they had. And so it really sort of speaks to the politics of that. It's less about indigeneity in the Caribbean context in this period. Even though there's some really interesting moves around who is indigenous and who is not, and claims being made through that now in our contemporary moment, which we can get into later if you'd like, because it's outside of the preview of this particular question. But it's very interesting, sometimes very confusing to me, how people use that category of indigenous nowadays. But to answer your question, Erica, if that answers your question, that is sort of the trajectory of multiracialism in that period, or in a couple different periods, and what it sort of meant in terms of class and indigeneity.
So I want to pivot a little bit to ask the question about gender, but kind of stay with some of the contradictions that come up. So in the first chapter of the book, you explained that the members of the Universal Rasta Improvement Association were clear about their desire to build an African nation. The vision was also a masculine, heteronormative one that included a great deal of moralizing. For the Rastafarian men of the URIA, the progress of the race was closely intertwined with issues of gender and sexuality. Crucial to their ideas about racial progress were clear views about the role of women in building a nation. And obviously, many people have things to say about the role of women in building a nation. But I wanted you to talk a little bit more about what appear to be some of the contradictions that come up, even as there is a desire to move away from sort of Eurocentric patriarchal standards. There are some other complicated ways that some things are carried on, which might include things like preoccupation with women's sexual deviance, maybe in relationship to contraceptive usage, these other kinds of things. So can you talk a little bit more about how those tensions work out for you?
Yeah. So, Lord, I mean, well, first of all, Rasta people, or when Rasta emerged in the 30s, gender equity, or I think you said something about as the sort of stated goal. It was not a stated goal to address gender in any way. And that was a blind spot, not just of Rasta people, I'd say generally in Jamaica, but beyond in that period. People were not thinking about that generally, right? Or men, I should say, we're not thinking about that. But I think the contradictions are the contradictions we find in other forms of nationalism, and certainly in Black nationalism, right? In UNIA, in Nation of Islam. Okay, it's like, I mean, they're very, very similar. And some of it, I think, is really about Black men thinking about the nation as a way to protect women, which obviously is deeply problematic, but this is their line of thinking. They are, a lot of the primary sources talk about the extent to which Black women were raped during the period of enslavement. And so how to protect them is to, police what they wear, how they behave, to police sexuality, all of these things with which we're familiar, right? They also have a real, in resisting, this is where the kind of sort of anti-colonial critique goes all the way wrong to a very kind of conservative or some conservative gender politics, in that they also thought of themselves as embracing a real kind of pre-colonial idea of how men and women related to each other. And the most common example was polygamy. And most people had no real understanding of how polygamy functioned in any pre-colonial African society. It was a way within the Jamaican context, to just have multiple women at once. And I'm not saying that was a Black thing either, because, we know that, white men, during and after slavery did this quite a bit. And through the prism of British cultural imperialism, it sort of got, Black men were accused of doing that, but not white men, right? So it just is, a major, one of the ways I would say that within Rasta, men kind of undermine the revolutionary potential of a movement, and had to work through those contradictions. Now, I also want to be careful to say that the Rasta of the 70s is not the Rasta of the 30s, the Rasta of now is not the Rasta of the 30s, of the 70s. And so there has been quite a bit of evolution, and the diversity within the movement also means that, there were spaces within which women had greater autonomy from jump, right? I will also say that we have to distinguish between the way that women were discriminated against within Rastafari, and also the way that the scholarship on Rasta women ignored women. So there's a lot of work on this, some forthcoming, Dave Dunkley's new book, Shamara Wiley Al-Hassan's work, where they're really getting into even our understanding of who started the movement, right? I remember I was raised in the 12 tribes of Israel, and I remember I went home, I was doing a master's at Cornell in Africana Studies. I went home to interview members of the movement I was raised in, and I went to see a really, really old woman. And I said to her, everybody knows the story of Gadman, the founder of the 12 tribes, one of the major Rasta groups, as the founder, as the leader, as the prophet. And I said to her, when did you join the movement? And she gave me like a side eye before side eye was a thing. And she was just like, join the movement. I founded it. I helped to start it, right? And so I really love the work, Dave's work, Shamara's work, that's really setting that record straight now. So a lot of, most researchers, many of them traveled to Jamaica in the 50s and 60s, working to uncover Rasta histories, and a lot of it anthropological and sociological work, and they just did not look for the women. And many of us took as gospel, many scholars since then, took as gospel whatever they said in those really early works, and just perpetuated, many very erroneous ideas about the movement. So there are a lot of different moving parts. So I want to say the scholarship is one thing, but yes, there has been this history, but it has also changed considerably since the movement emerged.
I just want to add quickly, when I was having a conversation with Patricia Rodney about like her time in Jamaica and, groundings with my brother. So like people try to have all these perceptions about Walter Rodney and his gender politics and also Rasta, but she was like, number one, I was there. She was there alongside Walter when he is having these gatherings with Jamaican or with the Rasta. And there were other women there, right? Not a lot, but they were there. And also he did not pick the title Grounding with My Brothers. So it's not as if he was trying to erase the fact that women were there. And so when you were talking, it just reminded me of that, how we assume because of scholarship and because of our own understandings of whatever gender and patriarchy, like we map this onto particular groups or our understandings of situations that are not necessarily so.
Yeah, we just keep it going. We don't really get into the deeper sort of epistemological questions when we read, when we read anything actually. Like, how does this person know this, and what kinds of assumptions go into that conclusion? Yeah, so it's an important thing to consider.
Related to the last question and what Sharice just said, the role of women in Rastafarian society is often projected solely as like patriarchal, right? So what does Western feminism's observation of Rastafarian society, what did they get wrong about the autonomy of women? And then what's the significance for you about women like, is it Kusimbo? Is that, yeah.
Yeah, December. Yeah, so I mean, Western feminism flattens a lot about Rasta women and Black women more broadly. So I want to say it's very difficult to generalize about Rasta women because of the diversity within the movement, right? And I was very careful about that in the book. I didn't want Kisembo to represent all Rasta women, even though she represents many. So I just want to make that point. So of course, you know, I think one, as a historian, I'm opposed to conducting research, whether it be interviews or looking at archival documents and going in with a theory in mind, like imposing a theory on experiences of people. So whatever I came to in the book, I came to through the research, right? Through what the people told me or through what I read in the sources, and didn't go in, obviously we don't go in as a Black slave, but in terms of the theories that people tend to cling to, you know, sometimes they're not applicable. So we miss the nuances, right? And Rasta women, obviously, I think Eula Taylor said it best, you know, when she's thinking, or she was thinking through Amy Jacques, and really how do you balance a commitment to Black nationalism, to racial politics or racial, to the liberation of Black people, and to, you know, really having all the freedoms you know you should have as a woman. And for Rasta women in particular, what I do with Kisembo, what I learned through Kisembo is it's complicated. So Western feminism might miss, right? That you might go in and assume this woman is oppressed, suppressed, that she needs to be liberated. And you talk to these women and they have a very, very different understanding, right? That, I mean, who am I to go into an interview with a woman who says, listen, I am not only committed to Rastafari as politics, right? Kisembo was very much committed to Rastafari. She was not Rasta just because Raspuper, her husband, was Rasta. She was as committed to repatriation. I mean, she had to have been. Life was so hard, right? She had to have been. But there's also this element of religion, which messes everything up. That when we get to religion, we think we can still make assumptions based on class, based on level of education. And what I've learned is that you really cannot. That women at all levels will say, listen, I read the Bible and the brethren and I agree that man is the head of woman. And I'm fine with that as long as he lives up to his responsibilities, right? So he can't come home and smoke a spliff and say Selassie and everything is fine, right? And within the context of that arrangement, if that's not happening, they often rebel in really interesting ways, right? Because they're like, I'm actually fulfilling the role the man is supposed to, and I'm not doing that, right? That may not be okay for me, right? But we cannot, in my mind, as historians and as researchers, go in with that level of judgment or those assumptions about what constitutes freedom on different levels for women or for anybody, actually. So I think that's some of what we miss. And I think in terms of the repatriation, I think in the same way that men had to go and confront what it was like to actually live this life on the ground, right? And I keep trying to normalize, you know, people see contradictions within Pan-African practice, and the next move they make is to dismiss the validity of Pan-Africanism. And I think that is so absurd, because I think it's a global imaginary. Clearly, you're going to have to figure out how to translate that into any local space, right? And it's the same for, it was not just the case for Ras Bupe, who we imagine as taking on the political work, or he imagined himself as taking on the political work of the repatriation, but it's the same for her, and had to adapt and take care of her family and take care of herself, and learn as well what that experience would demand of her. In terms of, I think I'm missing a final piece of your question, Erica. I think you said something about what does she represent? You know what? I have to tell the truth. I don't. So the book was done, and all of the women who were, I don't know if you remember from the book, the wives of Ketenge Sekoni, who died on a flight back to the UK because he was so sick. And they're in the UK, and I tracked them down, eventually found them, and they refused to speak, even with, amazing contacts or people to vouch for me. They refused to speak. And some of that was the kind of, Rasta people, many Rasta people do not trust scholars, even scholars with my background, they can be skeptical. But some of it is that was a very painful experience that people don't want to rehash, and you have to kind of respect that, right? So the book was actually done. I'd given up, couldn't find Kisembo, and then she responded, and I delayed the production of the book to talk to her, and she changed the book, and I don't think I would have been able to write Kisembo. I made her read it, and in a way that allowed her to see herself in what I wrote. Had I not been raised around women like her, I was able to actually see her, and understand the choices that she had made, and to understand the way that a lot of women who are part of revolutionary movements will pause, even within the context of trouble in a relationship, to say, do I make a move now, or do I wait because we're on a larger mission, right? Which is really interesting to me. So I see her as really, even for women who did not get the opportunity to repatriate, she still represents many of the women who were navigating the sort of received wisdom about what Rastafari is, navigating that while also, going through all of the changes in terms of the roles of women in society, and dealing with that too, and tailoring it to the specific needs of not just a Black woman, but a Black revolutionary pro-Africa woman, right? So in the end, I was really fortunate to have her change the book, and even sort of broaden my understanding of repatriation through a woman's experience.
I think there's so much there that we could talk about. Just in terms of both your own process and how to engage in a community where you come from, and how that gives you a particular kind of attentiveness, ask how you write people and respect the lives they live and the work that they do. Maybe we can have that conversation another time. But I wanted to ask a question about something that comes up in chapter 4. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just gonna say, I think it's interesting. I think for me, it was just like, I just tell the truth, because I'm like both inside and outsider. Because by the time I did this research, I no longer identified as Rasta, and I would just tell them. But always find, 19th century anthropologists and others, and more recent ones, that would dress up like a Messiah or something. I always find that so interesting, because people feel you, 2 minutes in, they meet you and they decide if they're going to talk to you and trust you or not, I think. So I remember before I went to meet Ras Bupe, a Tanzanian Rasta woman is the one who told me about him. And she was like, wrap up your hair and wear a long skirt. And I was like, no, I'm wearing my jeans because I don't want malaria. And I'm not going to pretend, that I'm somebody else for anybody.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that my childhood didn't have an impact at all, because I don't think I would have been able to write the book had I not been raised in the 12 tribes. I don't think I would have gotten the documents. I wouldn't have been able to find people. Like, I know that to be true. But I also think people either trust you or they don't.
I had a similar experience. So I am an anthropologist by training. And I remember one of the first times I went into the field to do research in Venezuela, I was at a community meeting and this older Black woman stood up. I had already been introduced to her. She knew who I was. She knew I was there. But she basically like gave this public admonition to the room. There was like, these people who come here to write books about us and leave and don't do shit after that, like we're not doing that shit no more. And she didn't say it directly to me, but I knew it was a warning to me.
Right,
and
right.
I think it was also like so how you gonna respond to this? So I just remember.
Right. And it goes, and there's always a price to pay, right? Like we have to tell the truth about that too. Like like Rascal trusted me, but you know, it was getting kind of tense. Maybe like 2 years before the book came out, he was like, remember, this is not an academic, it's a spiritual, journey. Because, his whole thing was like, just sent you to do the work. But so I was like, bro, man, it's academic and I'm not lying. It's not like I get the spiritual part and I really respect it and understand it on a cellular level, right? My parents wanted to repatriate, so I get it. Like that was my childhood, I get it. So, but I'm also writing a book and I'm telling you the truth and I need to get tenure. And I'm not going to lie about, I get it on all those levels, but there's also that element I can't lie about. And it was kind of tested for a little bit. But all of those, all the things they told me not to repeat, I haven't. So I think there are different ways to maintain your integrity.
Yeah.
Parts of the story that I had to keep, so.
For sure.
Go ahead, Layla, your question finally.
So speaking of repatriation, in chapter 4, you say that Tanzania revealed a tension between the ideal of a stateless African identity and the political necessity of the apparatus in effecting the return. You also referenced the Rastafarian adage that, quote, one should not trade an island for a continent, when detailing the issue many Rastafarians confronted when they attempted to repatriate. One of the main issues they encountered was having to claim the Jamaican state on the one hand in order to leave for Tanzania. So can you say more about the complicated relationship of repatriation to Rastafarian understandings of pan-Africanism? And then how does the shift from a stateless African to a Tanzanian resident or citizen result in maybe a different pan-African practice for them?
Yeah, so I mean, again, I think this is just one of the ways that they all, Tanzanian state officials and the Rasta people had to think through or navigate how you really live an idea on the ground, how you translate this global imaginary, how is it going to work, right? I think, again, it is, like the contingencies of a particular historical moment. I think, they're able to go because independence happened and these leaders have the power to bring this about. And so it's the reality of the situation in this moment. But I also will say, even though it is, and I did write about it as a contradiction, that that Rasta people would not, in that period, would not have generally equated a diasporic state with an African state, right? Because what comes with a diasporic nation state is yet another imposed identity that tries to root you in the new world, so to speak, in the Americas, in slavery, right? And so in a sense, it's an important difference. One, it's pragmatic. However, we get to stay. We just have to roll with it and do it, right? But on the other hand, it is, it's a difference between if you're being claimed by an African nation and you're on the African continent, then it doesn't have to be a Tanzanian citizen doesn't have the same, it's a point of pride in a way that a Jamaican identity was not for a Rasta person, right? For those in my study, I should say. And so I think that's the major, for Pan-Africanism, it is, how Pan-Africanism evolved and what this period allowed and did not allow. And also, I think we can't mistake the difference between what it means to identify with a nation state in Africa, right, where colonialism did not remove people physically, right, from the continent, as opposed to slavery being the slavery constructed identity against which Rasta people rebelled, right? And going back to Africa meant, okay, if embracing an African identity means I have to claim nation, then fine. Even with all the contradictions therein. The other thing I will say is, final thing I'll say about this is that, a lot of Rasta people in the early years had a kind of Ethiopianism type understanding of Africa, where Ethiopia was Africa, right? So I think that the period of decolonization also brought the rest of Africa, or made it more visible for a lot of people who had not really thought about it. Right? They had a romanticized idea, and we understand that, we know how it functions. But I think, and even Haile Selassie's activism around pan-Africanism during this period also helped to open them up to other areas of Africa. And okay, I lied, I said it was a final, but the final is also that, people had already begun to move to Shashamane in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia at that point did not have any kind of state mechanism for them to remain. So when Tanzania offered this, it was also like, oh my God, that's it. I think on the ground, they made the leap of like, our idea or choice to identify in this particular way, which colonial officials and even Jamaican people at all levels of society saw as just crazy, that an African nation state, like an continental African leaders validated their notion of diaspora and recognized them as Africans returning home. I mean, that is really actually, quite remarkable, right? So I think that's how that kind of resolved itself, if that's the way to think about it.
I have this tattoo, the Psalm 68:31, which is like that whole. I'm thinking about so many things. I'm thinking about sort of East Africa and how East Africa figures into a Pan-African imaginary or a Pan-African praxis, even as we know that the majority of enslaved Africans in the diaspora came from like the Bight of Biafra, the Bight of Benin, and other places in West Africa, because even Kwanzaa is like an East African harvest. It's rooted in East Africa. So it's interesting to think like one aspect of that is a sort of eschewal of that, of slavery as a basis of that identity. And then the Ethiopian is, and like Ethiopia is its own thing, right?
Its own thing. Yes.
The imperialism of that like nation state project in and of itself, and the false idea that it was never colonized, right? That it was always colonialism animated that whole deal. Liberia too. So my question has to do with CLR James, who I'm ambivalent about for a number of reasons, but so okay.
Clearly.
Yeah. So in chapter 6, Strange Bedfellows, Rastafari, CLR James, and the Africa in Pan-Africanism, you write that the anti-colonialism of the Rastafarian movement in Tanzanian state officials, the latter led by Nyerere, saw the liberation of the mind as a central component of its struggle. In keeping with their emphasis on the reclamation of the dignity of the African, Rastafarians and these Tanzanian state officials aim to affirm an African identity. By contrast, CLR James found European culture to be the basis of the Caribbean, or basically the apotheosis of culture writ large, and was ambivalent about African culture. But he nonetheless supported Rasta repatriation to Tanzania and was laudatory of Tanzania as the inheritor of Pan-Africanism, especially after Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown in 1966. So can you talk about how such different views of European and African culture could nonetheless be reconciled around the idea of African liberation?
I love how your questions are like essays. I'm like over here like
too long.
I know. It's like, here's my essay. Okay. Yeah. So people struggle with this. I think within the context of struggle, people come to terms in certain ways. And with a kind of complexity that defies the neat categories that people tend to seek, right? So we are so wedded to not just the larger things like, oh, Du Bois versus Garvey, and all of these ways that we're really rigid. One of them, of course, is this cultural nationalism versus Marxism. And so we assume a really rigid divide. And of course, there were rifts, right? But there were also formations, new formations that transcended the rifts in a way. And I think we have to, think about a couple of things. So one, I would say, I need to make the point that Ras Bupe lived a life of the mind. He was very much an intellectual. And so in, talking to, with, and exchanging ideas with CLR James, like it's very easy for me to understand why they became friends, in a sense, allies, the letters between them, all of that, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is people evolve, right? So James lived a long life. He was very critical of Rastafari in an essay he wrote in the late 60s. But then he was captured in a video after that at some point, really, praise is not the word, but really offering respect, right, for their commitment and what they were trying to do. So people evolve and people can recognize or pay respect to other people because of their shared commitment to a larger principle, right? And a larger principle of liberation. I think if you live long enough, you start to understand that there's no perfect sort of flat unity in a sense, right? The other thing I would say is human beings are complex. That the truth of the matter is colonialism makes for a particular type of complexity within human beings. So, and within movements. So Rastafari incorporates quite a bit of Christianity. Some people might see that as a contradiction. Some people might, say you're Africanizing Christianity, but either way, that's a thing. We know what the contradictions within James were, but I think our fiction or writers of fiction, I think, captured it best. People like George Lamming and Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Paul Marshall and all these people writing about what does it mean to actually be anti-colonial in the language of the colonizers. And, in the case of James, it's like I'm critical of James, but I also do understand that in his generation, it was quite a leap to be schooled, to be formally schooled in the Western tradition and to really buy into, what it means to study the Enlightenment and all of this. Julius Nyerere was translating Shakespeare into Swahili. Right? These, so on one hand, people have a deep appreciation for ideas and, things that are cultural production from other cultures that we think of as being oppressive. But these are human beings, right? So I think it is my short answer at the end of the long answer is that all of these people and movements really contributed to African liberation, right? That's undeniable. But there are all of these contradictions. I think colonialism set us up to have them, and that people tried to work through them. Some were more successful than others. But I think our pursuit of a kind of purity makes us as scholars dwell on, or not look for the ways that people transcended these differences. And also, the ways that people sometimes would publicly say one thing as a form of strategy, but actually do another in their lives. That's how I would respond to that.
Yeah, it's when you were talking, like we treat Black history like a versus battle. That's how it always is.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And secondly, CLR James was a hater his whole life. He might have transited some shit. He was a hater his whole life, and I will die on that hill. But anyway.
I mean, Minka McClellan and I fight all the time about CLR James because he always says he loves CLR more than I. Yeah, but it's still, I see the man though, because I think of when, he was born at what, the turn of the century. Seriously. So, in a way to get where he got, and then all the things are documented in the book about him donating to liberation movements and all of that. I just think he was dealing with an inner contradiction. And We all do to a certain extent. So, Layla, what were you saying?
It was just also making, so we hosted a conversation yesterday on Nkrumah's conscientism, and one of CBS's critiques of Nkrumah was a reading of him as possibly Eurocentric, because he primarily engaged with European philosophers in conscientism. But then, and so one of the questions you asked was, well, why wasn't he engaged in Yere, in that moment? But then, as you're talking about him translating Shakespeare into into Swahili French people as a product of his time. And I think it's just interesting to think about, what that leap really looks like for them, coming from where they come from at the moment that they're coming from there.
I did not say that. I did not say Nkrumah was Eurocentric. I said conscientism was giving Eurocentrism, because it was, because all the people that are named in that shit are whites and Amo. That was my point.
I thought that's what I said.
You said I said Nkrumah was Eurocentric.
Thank you, Erica. Ain't that what I said? Ain't that what I said?
Eurocentrism. You just said that. Roll it back
because I literally said because he primarily engaged European thinkers as philosophers in conscientism. So I gave it to you. You can roll your eyes all you want.
I said the text. Anyway, Erica, last question.
So finally,
Lord.
Yeah, speaking of Nkrumah, both Kwame Nkrumah and Walter Rodney, they offer criticisms for Ujamaa as culture reductionists, neglecting the class issue. So was Nahiri's Ujamaa solely a reaction to the Western world and its concepts like Marxism, or did Nahiri truly believe that the class contradictions could not exist in an African society? And do you feel the latter is a more prominent understanding of Ujamaa?
So no, to answer the question bluntly, no, I do not think it was merely a reaction to Western ideas, or to say we're going to choose an African-centered path to sort of post-colonial innovation, and we're going to just reject Europe in this kind of shallow way. Not at all. Nyerere was very much an intellectual and read widely, was very well read, and in my view, genuinely selected from, everything he read and everything to which he was exposed growing up as a child in Tanzania. Selected what he thought would really serve this particular society, or his particular society, as a form of African socialism, right? The other side of it is that he was really, truly idealistic, right? And I think many of our leaders during this period were. And I see your eyes, Sharice, but I'm less critical of idealism because we have to start somewhere.
Right? He threw Babu in jail, so I'm salty about that. Okay.
And many people saw him as idealistic, but think about it. He started with Ujamaa, the pamphlet, which was not scientific socialism, which was not a template about how to build socialism, in terms of the economy and how the society would be structured. It was about the ethics of it. It is what he called a state of mind. So he was an African leader who knew that it wasn't just, the Negroes in the Americas who were messed up mentally by colonialism, right? And psychologically. He knew that there was a need to decolonize the mind, right? And I think that we miss the significance of that in Nyerere, right? So he thought, we can look back and be like, oh God, that's naive Nyerere, but he really genuinely thought, if I start by pushing people to value the way that agricultural societies function, which meant everybody had to work, and I make that the basis of nation building, then people will not want to acquire wealth at the expense of other people. It was naive, obviously. But he really genuinely thought that targeting the minds and hearts of people would make a difference. So he thought that through, right? Then he got to 1967 and issued the Arusha Declaration, because he realized, and Nyerere was very good at admitting, well, listen, I was wrong. I didn't see that coming. I think you said something like there's a document called the Arusha Declaration 10 years later in 77, where he's like, I'm really bad at predicting the future, clearly. But he recognized that, all of these disparities and, some people are getting wealthy while the vast majority of people are really, really very poor. And that was, the attempt to, nationalize, banks, etc., and to kind of get into building socialism. And one of the main, one of the clauses that caused real problems within the administration, because everything was always contested within Tanzania, even though we like to think Nyerere just controlled everything. Was this clause that leaders, members of government were not allowed to own property. They could only own the houses they lived in, that people were really upset about that, right? So I think it was a real genuine, I think Nyerere had the best of intentions. Obviously, I think he was a man, he was flawed, he made mistakes. I also think that he was trying to navigate this type of nation building within the context of the Cold War. I think he was trying to navigate non-alignment within the context of extreme poverty, right? I think, of course, there were always more radical leftist elements within Tanzania. You mentioned Babu, that they, had all of these conflicts. So you always had that element, and people on the outside, meaning the so-called superpowers, were always really mindful of those as well. But I think Ujamaa was designed to get people to have a socialist mindset. And he hoped that that would translate into a socialist society, but it didn't quite, work out that way.
Wasn't it modeled after the Israeli kibbutz? Wasn't that the sort of basis? And he had these Israeli.
I think you're thinking about that influence on like villagization in particular.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
The practical application.
The pamphlets that he issued right after independence, was really his sort of thinking about, just the state of mind with an ethos, what it meant to be a socialist in the mind, and then move from there. Then villagization, of course, how that worked out on the ground and pulling influences from different places became something else, over which I lost control as well by the time we get to like 73.
Well,
Layla, you have a burning question.
No, I don't actually. So I was actually just going to say that I'm just really grateful for the conversation that we've been able to have today and the range of the conversation. And also just, I love all of our guests, but I really appreciate how you're able to hold. I know we ask long questions sometimes, and you're able to hold all of the parts in.
Really because I was never sure I was holding all the parts.
No, I think you did. So I just want to thank you on behalf of all of us. Hopefully we will have you back, and just remind the audience to check out your book, Jah Kingdom by Dr. Monique Bodacy, and just want to say thank you. Oh,
thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. All right, y'all. So for this episode, we are bringing back Left Disquisition, which is where we talk about what's being talked about, discussed, analyzed, commented on, or critiqued on the platforms or from the organizations that I learned from, whether it's the Communist, Black Agenda Report, Red Nation, or etc. And so today we are talking about this piece that was written by the AAPRPGC.
So the piece that we're reading from is a piece in progress. It should be live on the website either today or tomorrow. But it's essentially trying to think through why, as Pan-Africanists, the question of Russia and the Ukraine should be important to us as Pan-Africanists and as African people. And so that's what we're going to talk through a little bit today. And so I think Erica's going to kick us off with starting to read.
Class struggle in Ukraine. In the Ukraine, at the same time European imperialism was ravaging other parts of the world, the CIA worked with neo-Nazis and ultra-nationalists in Ukraine for decades, starting right after World War II. It was Project Aerodynamic, CIA in the 1950s and 60s, and recruited Ukrainian nationalists, included Nazis and war criminals such as Mykola Lebed, who was accused of killing tens of thousands of Poles and Jews, and to work against the USSR. These are the same right-wing nationalists and racist elements, including Zionists, that are in power today in Ukraine and are now under attack by the Russian government and military and the justice and peace-seeking Ukrainian people. The treatment of African students by the police and other civil officials clearly shows a racist element is in power in Ukraine. Zionism is also in power in Ukraine. International Zionism and Zionist occupiers of Palestine are being mobilized by Ukrainian President Zelensky to send funds and other resources to Ukraine and cultivate political and military support to keep him and other NATO, USE, COM, and NED allied puppets in power.
Yeah, so I mean, this Russia-Ukraine situation is quite interesting, and I think there's so many different dynamics that are going on, and that make it hard and complicated to think about outside of Europe. And this is actually a very small thing for me, but I just, coming from the US, thinking about how small Europe really is, like from where I am physically in Western Germany, Kiev is like driving from Boston to Chicago. And so I'm just thinking about the fact, being here in this sort of European context and thinking about how it matters for me physically here, and then also how it matters for me politically, sort of ideologically. And I think it's really important that we think about how complicated, what it means to support some element of this struggle, and who are we supporting. And so I think one of the things that comes out in this first part of this, the class struggle in the Ukraine, is that one, we always have to have a principled support for people, right? For the masses of people, right? And so there is an understanding that the masses of people in the Ukraine are suffering as a result of these wars that were facilitated by Western European interests, but that these issues of racism under sort of neo-Nazi rule and the issue of Zionism are all tied up in this. And so that we always have to sort of understand the interrelated or interconnected nature of these forms of oppression and struggles that are happening.
Yeah, and so, in BAP, Black Alliance for Peace, we talk about the US, EU, NATO axis of domination, not to excuse Russia in any way, but to really shed light on why we are where we are. And the other important thing about the neo-Nazi element is, on the one hand, I think the overemphasis on that can sort of miss the forest for the trees. But at the same time, what's important about it is that the long-standing relationship between the United States and fascism and Nazis and neo-Nazis should not be obfuscated by the fact that there was a temporary alliance between the US and USSR during World War II. That was interest convergence. But overwhelmingly, the reason why the US is so sympathetic to these elements is because of their anti-socialism, because of their anti-communism, and because of the way that in Mussolini, for example, in Italy, and then Hitler in Germany, crushed workers' movements, crushed unions, and really empowered capital. And so this is a lot. So what we need to really understand is that the reason why fascism is much more amenable to like US liberalism than is communism or socialism is precisely because of that point. Is precisely because of the economic interests that are embedded in sort of fascist, neo-Nazi and Nazi elements. And so the other thing that's important in terms of what was read so far is all of these other elements, NATO, US, European Com, NED, CIA, like all of these sort of entities within the US state apparatus are central to what is going on, what the sort of the long array of this conflict, which dates back to the Cold War era, and what's happening contemporarily. And so this is what, when we focus on that axis of domination, this is what we're trying to pull into sharp relief.
Right. I think one of the more significant parts about that is the naming of Zionism. I think the pushback that we receive the communists for highlighting the Nazism that's being supported by the US, EU, NATO axis of domination is that Zelensky is Jewish, right? And of course, we could always respond with, well, Obama was black, Obama's a black man that didn't. But I think that because he is Jewish, it obfuscates or people are easily dismissing the issue of the normalization of neo-Nazism, because regardless of what's happening there, the way that it's being responded to here in the US is extremely problematic. Rachel Maddow had the former ambassador to Russia revision Hitler. Like they're trying to make claims that Hitler wasn't as aggressive to ethnic Germans, or he wasn't, as genocidal as Putin. And I think that in the long run, what does that mean for a U.S. that's holding a January 6th commission, right? That's trying to hold these same elements under accountability as they're funding these elements with massive amounts of weapons that we can't account for, with our tax money that we cannot account for, and they're branding them all over our TV screens. And I think just yesterday, Pelosi said the Slava, the glory to Ukraine statement. So the minimizing of the neo-Nazism, for me, on the grander scale here in the U.S., poses a larger problem for what we as Africans should be prepared for.
So we're going to keep going in the statement. Now, this section is a little bit longer, so bear with me. This section of the statement is NATO, US, AFRICOM, NED, and neocolonialism in Africa. NATO, AFRICOM, and NED are allied with the neocolonial puppet governments of Africa. NATO, AFRICOM, and NED's role in Africa is to protect the African elites, the African rich and wealthy, the political robbers and thieves, the anti-people living off of the labor of the oppressed and exploited masses. NATO, AFRICOM, and NED keep the African bourgeoisie from being removed from power. NATO, AFRICOM, and NED's role is also to crush, by whatever means, all revolutionary and genuinely democratic, pan-Africanist, and socialist movements, mass political parties, and governments in Africa. Africa's neocolonial puppets are in principled opposition to the people's mass political power being seized by the struggling African masses. NATO, AFRICOM, and NED are allied with the African Union, was also a puppet of international imperialism. NATO dictates, quote, that well beyond the Euro-Atlantic region, the alliance continues to support the African Union in its peacekeeping missions on the African continent, end quote. African people must defend themselves and take the offensive against the African anti-people and international imperialism en route to pan-Africanism, which we understand is a total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism. The National Endowment for Democracy, or NED, is operating throughout Africa. NED has identified the following countries as a focus for its civil manipulation, ideological and cultural domination, and if necessary, reactionary regime change schemes. These countries are Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Ghana, Guinea, Malawi, Niger, Nigeria, Sudan, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. In addition, NED reports, quote, the fight against kleptocracy emerged as a major theme of NED's work in Africa, and the correct efforts of NED's partners scored significant victories, starting to rein in some of the worst offenders, which, end quote, which is, they say that a victory for NED is a defeat for Africa. NATO and USECOM were central to the immoral and illegal bombing of Libya on April 15th in 1986, codenamed Operation El Dorado Canyon. England was the air base of the operations. Imperialism committed a crime against Africa and humanity again in Libya on March 19, 2011, led by NATO and USECOM under the cover of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1973. The outcome of this imperialist act of aggression and war was the overthrow of the Socialist People's Libyan Arab, how do you say that, Jamahira? In addition to the murder of President Muammar Gaddafi under the watchful eye of the world. Quote, since June 2007, NATO has assisted the AU mission in Somalia, by providing air and sea lift support for AU peacekeepers following renewed AU requests. NATO was also providing capacity building support as well as expert training to support the African Standby Force at the AU's request. The ASF is intended to be deployed in Africa in times of crisis and is part of the AU's vision for continental on-call security apparatus with similarities to NATO's response force. In addition to these imperialist operations in Africa, AFRICOM and NATO are entrenched in Africa. The United States has 29 known military facilities in 15 countries on the continent, while France has bases in 10 countries. No other country from the outside of the continent has military bases in Africa. Consequently, NATO and AFRICOM operate in Africa with impunity in order to maintain neo-colonial political, ideological, economic, and cultural relationships with its former colonies and to impose neo-colonialism on the people. Neither NATO's nor AFRICOM's militaries or any of these financed civil societies and organizations should be on one speck of African soil. So that's a lot. What does that have you all thinking about?
I think that what's important to note for me is the arming element, right? That NATO and the US arming Ukraine's dumping massive amounts of weapons, most recently to the tune of what, 13.6 billion that was approved by Congress, is part of this long history of arming people or arming regimes who are fighting against the people. And so again, Ukraine needs to be in place in a sort of the broader purpose and the broader actions and efforts of NATO. Like, this is not something that's unique. And we can get sort of bogged down by the sort of the Russian question, right? The fact that Russia invaded Ukraine and again missed the broader provocations on the one hand, and the fact that the US and NATO are invading everywhere else. That ostensibly what makes this a sort of notable conflict is because Russia is a superpower with nuclear weapons. But if we really care about people, if we really care about peace and stability, if we really care about sovereignty, if we really care about self-determination, then that shouldn't be the sticking point. That should not be the basis for when a conflict is important versus when it's not. If invasion is bad, invasion is bad. If breaching sovereignty is bad, breaching sovereignty is bad. If war and militarism and warmongering are bad, it's bad across the board, not only when it suits the propaganda machine or it suits the economic interests of the United States. And mind you, now the US is trying to provoke China. So essentially what it's saying is that Russia beseeched China to help stave off the sort of economic collapse that's happening as a result of these really unprecedented level of sanctions, right? To the point where, for example, there are Russian tourists who are stuck in like Thailand because they cannot use their visas or MasterCards or American Express cards. The planes no longer fly there. And so ordinary people are bearing the brunt of this, as is the point of sanctions. So they're trying, so now Gerald Horne has argued that this conflict with Russia is a proxy for conflict with China. And we see it sort of unfolding in real time with Biden threatening that there will be, extreme consequences for China if they help Russia circumvent these sanctions. The US seems to fail to realize that China owns 40 to 50% of US debt. They produce a plurality to a majority of the world's goods. So you could try it if you want to. And all of this relates to ordinary African people and ordinary people, because if you think that inflation is high now, you think that gas prices are high now, wait until these supply chain issues, these issues of access to materials are exacerbated if the US increases the smoke with China alongside Russia. So it's all like, this matters to us. It matters to Ukraine, to ordinary Ukrainian people. It matters to ordinary African people. It matters very, very much because peace, war, let it say differently. War is the basis of suffering, period. It has all sorts of economic and political effects that we are going to bear the brunt of as people who are exploited and oppressed.
Right. I appreciate that the passage highlighted NED's role, because I don't think that that's emphasized enough. I think one thing that's important, that while it talked about all the things that it did in Africa, the basis of the 2014 coup, that main protests was NED funded. We look at protests in Cuba, NED funded. When we look at the protests in Haiti against, the popular democratically elected presidents, these are NED funded. The recently passed, or House passed at least, America Competes Act has a whole bunch of NED initiatives planned for Africa, for the Caribbean, for Latin America. So I think that in itself, I think, should be highlighted as another emphasis and tool of war, because I don't think that it's talked about enough. And also to the point of sanctions, right? Zimbabwe refusing to condemn Russia has led the U.S. to put more, or place more sanctions on Zimbabwe that's already heavily sanctioned and has been sanctioned for over a decade. So I think that these are the type of things that, because there are a lot of Africans and African organizations on the continent that do have the same sort of line that we're reading, that have a critical understanding of the cause and the crux of the issue, being NATO, being the U.S., being EU. That's not being publicized, I suppose, or that's not being promoted for the sake of, the neo-colonial speaking points of, Russia's bad, and, all of these other inconsequential, because as Sharice was saying, we're talking about nuclear powers here. And the fact that the US and NATO feel that they can strong arm these significant other powers. Like, what do you, from the question that I always raise with other Africans in these conversations about Ukraine is, how do you think they're going to react to our self-determination or our pushback, because they're clamoring now. Like, they are all in that, that we're seeing pan-Europeanism in its best, right? This is what they do as a unit, where we're like scattered all over the place. So I think that that's something that we need to emphasize, that they are definitely going to push back in this way. And then, I think that focusing on that axis of domination is the point that should be the focus for Africans. I think that we get caught up in the weeds of it. What is imperialism? Is Russia imperialist? As opposed to, the main and concrete, the objectively true issue here, that if NATO expands, that is awful for Africans. That is a bad thing for Africans. And I think that that's an objective truth that we have to keep sticking to.
Yeah.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I think for me, a couple of things come up. One, in terms of the specificity of the role of the relationship and the role of the AU, and how the AU's relationship to all of these other imperialist, expansive bodies that are doing the work of the West and the bidding of the West on the African continent, as I think one that some of us on the left are aware of, but then some people misread the AU for what the original vision of the OAU was. And I think that that's an important thing to think about. But also that because the AU exists the way that it does now, we as African people can't actually take advantage of these fucking white people fighting against each other right now, right? Because typically what happens is that when white people fight amongst themselves, we get a little bit of reprieve. And that's precisely what we see in relationship to sanctions, what's potentially happening in Venezuela right now. For the last 3 years, these people have been trying to impose this man Juan Guaido as a damn president, even though nobody knows who the fuck he is. Now all of a sudden the US wants to talk to the legitimate president Maduro about how to get some of that oil, because they fucked shit up elsewhere, right? And so, but because of the strange bedfellows that are made between the AU, NATO, NED, and USECOM, we don't have the capacity to take advantage, even in this little brief moment where they're dealing with each other, to actually say, okay, how do we want to shift our priorities, our agendas? Because so much of what our agenda is determined by their bullshit. So I mean, that's for me just another thing that comes out in thinking about the relationship between these international entities.
Just two other things too is that what it does is also discourage like African and Caribbean nations, for example, from diversifying the economic ties that they have to other nations. Because when you implement sanctions and make it illegal to do trade or to have, economic relationships with Russia, for example, and maybe China is on the horizon, which is just completely goofy, then it disincentivizes the building up of those relationships. And we can't forget the conflict that was happening mere months earlier in Mali, right? Because of Mali's relationship with a Russian, quote unquote, mercenary or private security firm, and the way that France doubled down, even with France's ambivalence vis-a-vis the United States because of US's domination of every country in NATO. France has to tail behind the United States in order to protect its interests on the African continent. And so it forecloses other types of economic relations and economic possibilities when the US engages in these forms of aggression. The other thing we might want to think about is bailouts. Now, all of these, there are a few large companies who are gonna lose their planes, for example, if Russia nationalizes all of the equipment and all of the resources that are left behind from all of these countries pulling out. Notoriously, these corporations are absorbing those fucking losses, even though it's like 3% or 5% of their total revenue or of the total share of their market. That is to say, Russia. The US tends to bail these people out. And what do they bail them out with? Taxpayer money, which is, again, the redistribution of wealth upwardly. And so while we can't even get no relief from fucking inflation, from COVID, from anything, we can't get 2 pennies to rub together. We try to make $1 out of 15 cents. There is a very high possibility that all of these corporations that are pulling out are going to get subsidies from the US government. So bet that shit. So that's the other thing that we need to think about. Like, this is not neutral, right? This has extreme economic ramifications and extreme sort of class implications for further gaps in accumulation. So just to bring this statement home, the next section is called NATO, US Ecom, NED, and the 2014, quote, Ukrainian Revolution. In 2014, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is operating as a surrogate for the CIA, assisted with the overthrow of Ukraine's democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, by funneling money as standard practice through its civil societies for that purpose. Soros' own group, IRF, or International Renaissance Foundation, admits in its annual 2015 annual report that it has spent more than 180 million in Ukraine since 1968. In 2014, Soros and other NGOs fomented the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. Zelensky, a Zionist and former Ukrainian actor and comedian, I'll get to that in a second, with no political experience, was selected by imperialism and the Ukrainian bourgeoisie to bring Ukraine under imperialism's orbit. NED claims that the overthrow of President Yanukovych originated with the journalist Mustafa Naim, whose Facebook post launched the Maidan protest and the Maidan uprising. And this was a profoundly democratic event, with the protesters embracing a concept of democratic citizenship involving individual responsibility to uphold democratic values in a larger community. US imperialism created the conditions for Ukraine to be brought under its tentacles. The fact that dude is a fucking actor and comedian is very, very important. It's giving Bobby Wine in Uganda. It reminds me of this line that Du Bois said in 1949, that anytime we want to, anytime we're working on race relations, we hand the mic to a baseball player. So all of that to say, the US picks these people who have little political experience, but who have clout to facilitate their imperial machinations and ambitions. And it's a parallel to what they do here, where they anoint random fucking celebrities, influencers, or whomever to tout their line and to grease their interests, and up to and including the US government briefing TikTok stars on what to say about the Ukrainian situation. And so the celebrity of politics, the sort of the influencer class, the celebrity class, and their close ties to imperialism is really, really important. It's not nothing. And so when we critique them, when we critique the niggerati, or we critique the celebrity class, we're not just being haters. It's because they're doing the work of empire and making empire more palatable and making people stupider for following blindly behind them. And so there's much more to say, but I'll kick it to my girls.
I think part emphasize what I was saying about NED and its role. But I do think it's interesting that you brought up Bobby Wine too, because what I was thinking about was like Trump, right? Because when we think about Trump he won the presidency after Zelensky was installed, right? But there's no criticism about Zelensky and where he's come from. But Trump was automatically dismissed because he had no political background or anything, but that's not the case for Zelensky. So I think that holding that contradiction or watching them attempt to hold that contradiction is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think the other thing that comes up for me in this is, again, these private sources of funding, right? So the mention of George Soros, who essentially funded the entire movement for Black lives in the US in its formal proper sense, right? Not necessarily referencing other smaller already existing organizations, but for the most part, all of that, the NGOification of Black political movement work in the US in the last, it's 2022. So in the last 10 years and earlier, but we know very explicitly in the last years has been funded by Soros, right? And so if we're thinking about the connections, what does it mean on the one hand for Soros to underwrite the movement for Black lives in the US, and then for Soros foundations to underwrite the so-called Orange Revolution in the Ukraine and to set the stage for what we're dealing with now, right? So even in thinking about this question about following the money in terms of private sources and whose interests are being served, right?
And the other thing about neo-Nazis and Nazism is that a lot of those groups form in response to somebody like Zelensky, for example, the fact that he is Jewish. So remember, there was a massive uptick in the Tea Party, for example, after Obama was elected, or when Obama was running for office, there was a massive buildup. So people want to attribute that to Trump, but the Trump is possible because of Obama. The swing to the right is possible because of Obama. And so the other thing that we need to realize is that it's not as if we shouldn't take Zelensky being president as a way to negate the realities of the formation of neo-Nazis, but rather part of their empowerment comes because they hate what the fuck they hate, right? And they become empowered when somebody like a Black or a Jew or a woman, often a Catholic, whatever, when those people come to power, it confirms their stupid agenda that these people are taking over and taking from the rightful heirs of power, or the people who deserve resources. And so I think that's something else, back to something else that you said, Erica, it's really, really important to think about what does it mean to normalize and empower and arm these people, right? Arming is really important because the US is already massively armed. And so when you normalize even more armed, racist, xenophobic, you name it, people, then what does that actually mean for the safety and security of the masses of people generally, but the masses of racialized people particularly, especially those who believe in economic redistribution, racial justice, peace, etc. So this matters to us Africans. Get it together.
Right. I think we see that play out at the border though, with all those colonized sects, right? I think that making it an issue solely of anti-Blackness misses the politics of both Poland and Ukraine that are significantly far-right nationalist politics. That plays a role into how they're reacting to it. I think there's a video going around now of an African student that's missing, that was being chased by neo-Nazis, and then they haven't seen him since because he was sent back outside. And I think that right there shows, because even with Zelensky, right, I think it's important to understand that Zelensky is a puppet, whether that's for the NATO forces or for the Azov battalion, right? Because it does not make sense when you see a Jewish person praise Stephen Bandera, right? But you also have to understand the role that Zelensky plays for these people, for these sects. Like as soon as he came in there, he placed all these people in powerful positions, knowing what they were and who they were, but they also placed him in his position, right? Because I think that he made it easier. Well, they made it easier for him and he made it easier for them. And this was all convenient for the US and NATO. So I think that those are things that we have to really take into account, because there's a lot of pushback about him being Jewish, as to say that, you know, a Jewish person cannot in any way collude with Nazis. And then I think about, how do people even understand the creation of the state of Israel? Because a lot of that was colluding with Nazis. So, so I think those are things that we have to be acutely aware of. But I think the mainstream media, and now to see actual politicians like the Speaker of the House normalize this and not see anything wrong with this, or even say glory to Ukraine at a press conference, that's troubling. That's like significantly troubling.
I think the last thing I'll say about this in the general sense is that the other thing, that the issues with African immigrants at the borders between the two, it brings up a couple of different things. Like I remember when Sharice and I were first talking about it, and just talking about the number of African students in a country like Ukraine. And we know that that is a byproduct of what colonialism has done to the continent and what it means to be able to get an education somewhere. But then also the impotence, the inability of African governments as they exist to actually, in fact, rescue their own citizens, right? I mean, shit, the Nigerian president was like, hold your bags, like hopefully we'll try to get there some kind of way. And that if you think about the AU as this purported, you know, unifying body that is supposed to, in theory, you know, extend the arm, their abilities as African countries to come together, and particularly precisely to respond to crises like these. So many of these African countries do not have the ability to do that. And it's not simply a matter of internal corruption, right? It is corruption, but it's not simply a matter of this kind of internalized, I don't know, like on black crime steroid version of people saying that African presidents are corrupt, right? That it is a product of all of these international entities and the way that they operate on the continent that are creating intentionally the impotence, right? And that's something that I think we also have to pay attention to, that's attention that's highlighted by what's happening at the border with African students as well.
You know, and the other thing I think that needs to be taken into account is we just really need to be mindful of these narratives, right? Because, for example, Russia has been dropping bombs in Syria for 10 years. The United States has as well. So if it's really about Russian aggression, Russian imperialism, why weren't there sanctions then? Why wasn't there this uproar then, right? And so again, we have to, it's all about Russia, number one, vis-a-vis Europe, which is why people are bringing up this Hitler, and the reason why in general Hitler is seen as like the monster of history, because he tried to colonize Europe. That is to say, he tried to use the techniques that were reserved for the coloreds on the whites. Let's be clear. And so this is again why we circle back to the US, EU, NATO axis of domination, because it wasn't that much smoke. Like, it wasn't until this particular conflict and Russia really vehemently opposing Ukraine joining NATO that this thing blew up. Finally, it's interesting, right? Because when all of those, when in China at the start of the pandemic, when all those Africans were being discriminated against and perhaps brutalized and marginalized, lots of coverage about this, right? It's been basically outside of social media, it's been radio silence about the treatment of these African and Indian and other racialized people's treatment at the hands of the Ukrainian military and government. So we have to think about this contradiction. So Black people, these people don't give a fuck about you, right? And it's like Erica saying, it's not just reducible to anti-Blackness. That is a part of it, but it has to do with imperial interests. It has to do, like, the US will pragmatically advocate for or look out for or whatever a group temporarily, but that's just, it has nothing to do with you and everything to do with their interests. It's the same shit about democratization, human rights, women. This is all like a subterfuge. As long as there's imperialism and as long as the imperialists are highly, highly armed and highly powerful, like none of this shit is in your interest. And so war is bad, y'all, and nuclear war is even worse. So my rant for this week is very short and sweet and to the point, and it's probably just a reiteration. Please take every advantage of your right to shut the fuck up. If you don't know what you're talking about, if you have never commented on an issue or related issue before, if you're simply offering half-baked ideas, pontifications, or very, very ill-informed commentary, just be quiet. You can say nothing. You can keep scrolling. You can hold your tongue as praxis. There's really no reason to comment on shit that you don't know anything about. You don't have to have your, contribute your voice to the void. You literally can just say nothing. If you know nothing of history, nothing of geopolitics, nothing of dialectics, nothing of politics, you don't have to comment on this Ukraine situation, for example. You literally can say nothing. Or take it to the group chat, take it to your diary, take it to Facebook, to your Facebook chat. Like, you don't have to broadcast your ridiculous ideas for everybody to hear. And so, there is this saying that it is better to be silent and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. It's something like that. But really, really marinate on this, because there are so many goofy, unnecessary, downright horrible, terrible, no good and very bad takes, especially on this Ukraine situation, and especially from our people, from Black people. There are so many things that we can have relevant, interesting, and informed commentary on, but this clearly isn't one of them. So I just want to reiterate and affirm our rights to shut the fuck up. Thank you. All right, y'all. So we have reached the end of the show. Of course, we want to shout out and thank our girl, Erica Keynes, for helping us with the show this week, for adding her brilliant commentary and analysis. And also, on the day that we're recording today, March 14th, it is not only Pi Day 3.14, but it's also the birthday of Dr. Robin D.G. Kelly. So happy birthday to the GOAT, one of the GOATs, one of the giants, one of the best to ever do it.
Not Pi Day. But we also wanted to let you all know that next week's show will be our last show of the season. So stay tuned. We have some exciting things in store, and that is our show for this Friday evening. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with us. So thanks as always for tuning in. I'm Dr. Layla Brown, here with my girl, Dr. CBS. Thanks as always to Two Black in the Back, and we're signing off.
See y'all.